Okay, so welcome everyone to this session. This webinar, as you can see, we'll be looking at the practical requirement, some people call it the practical exam, the NG2 or IG2, depending upon whether you're doing the national certificate or the international certificate. So NG2 and IG2 requirement for the NEBOSH certificate qualification. So as you probably know by now, this exam, this requirement is for you to complete a risk assessment, which encourages you, which enables you to demonstrate that you can apply what you've learned in your studies. So obviously the start of the studies, elements 1 to 4, we tend to call is more the management of health and safety. And elements in your learning materials, elements 5 to 11, is mostly around the practical side of health and safety, the hazards and the risks and the precautions from a health and safety point of view. So the principles of risk assessment you will have already studied way back in element 3 of the course. The NG2 part of it, the practical exam, you will be applying the technical detail, for want of a better term, the technical detail of the hazards that are covered in elements 5 to 11. So manual handling, dangerous or hazardous chemicals, DSE, display screen equipment, etc., moving machinery, transport and vehicles on site. So the process of doing a risk assessment you've done. Now what you're going to do is to apply the technical knowledge, the practical knowledge that you've gained from study elements 5 to 11 into the risk assessment requirement, which, as we said, is NG2, IG2. Okay, so basically what NEBOSH is saying in terms of the NG2 practical requirement is that it gives people the opportunity, as you can see, to practically apply the knowledge and understanding that you've gained from your studies. And obviously what they're asking you to do, therefore, is to complete a risk assessment to enable you to do that particular exercise. Okay. Hilary, I can see you've posted a question for me. If that's okay with you, can I actually answer that question a bit later where we have the session for questions? Okay, because I want to carry on with delivering the webinar for now, and then I'll come back to that question later, if that's okay. That's great, thanks. Okay, so what do we need to do with regards to the risk assessment? Now, before we look at that, can I just state, as you can see on the top of the screen here in the heading, it does actually say NG2. Don't worry about it, because the requirements for the international general certificate, the IG2, are exactly the same as the requirements for the national one. Okay, so the NG2 and the IG2 requirements are exactly the same. So please don't worry and think I'm doing the international version, but all of the slide headings seem to be talking about the national one. They're all the same, because it's exactly the same process, exactly the same procedure that you need to go through when you are completing the NG2. Okay, so the actual risk assessment itself, the requirements of it are split into 4 parts or 4 sections. You can see them there. Okay, so the actual guidance that NEBOSH provide, and I'll show you how you can get hold of that guidance in your learning materials later, says that there are 4 parts that need to be completed. As you can see in the blue, part 1 requires you to describe the organization where you are carrying out the risk assessment, and also to describe the methodology. In other words, the way that you went about doing the risk assessment. Who did you talk to? What did you look at? What documents did you have a read of and look at? What other reference material did you use when you were carrying out the risk assessment? So part 1, the organization and where you're doing the risk assessment, and also the methodology, how you actually physically did it. Okay, again, Julian, I'll answer that question a little bit later if I can, that you've put in the chat box there. Right, risk assessment part 2. This is where now we think about and we identify the risks associated with the activities. that are being carried out in that area where you are doing the risk assessment. And this is where we analyze not only then the hazards, but we also look at the risks from that hazard. And then we decide on the control measures, the precautions, and the timescales, the time that those actions should be completed by, and who is responsible for those. So again, we'll come back to these sections in much more detail in a moment to look at the detail that's required in these 4 parts. The third part is requiring you then to look back on the risk assessment that you've done and to pick and prioritize and choose 3 of the 3 actions which you think are the most important, and to talk about those actions, those recommendations, and say why you've chosen them and why it's important that we fulfill the requirement, that we fulfill that action that you've recommended. Okay, so you talk about not all of the risk assessment findings, but just 3 of them. Okay, and then the 4th part is review, communicate, and check. So how are you going to review the progress on the risk assessment? When are you going to review it? And how are you going to communicate the findings of that risk assessment to others in the workplace? Okay, so as I said, we'll go into these parts in much more detail in a moment. We're just giving you a quick overview of what's required to complete the assessment. So in essence, essentially, there are 4 parts to the risk assessments. Okay, the practical application in terms of the dates. Okay, there are specific dates which are set, which you can choose to submit your risk assessment by. I believe one of the dates coming up now is the 16th of December. I think someone said earlier on, which is fine. If you haven't already registered for any of those dates, then get in contact with us, follow the instructions that are in your learning materials. Towards the bottom of your learning materials, towards the top of the learning materials, there's a link there which says register in for the OBE, the exam, the NG1 exam, and also the practical assessment. So if you click on that and follow those links, that will then contact us at Astutis, and then one of our people in our exam section will then contact you with the available dates when you can complete the risk assessment and submit it to us by that date. Okay, most of you, I'm assuming, have probably already done that, and you've already got a date which you have to work to. So the date that you've been given is the date that you have to submit that risk assessment by to us. And you will be given the email address. I'll show you the details on one of the last slides that we'll have a look at. You need to email your NG2 IG2 risk assessment to that email address by the end of that particular day. Okay, if we receive it later than that day, then we have to record that you were absent, it was not submitted. So it's really important that you submit on that particular, or by that day which you've been given. Okay, so the paperwork itself, again, I'll show you a bit later where you can find it. Now, the paperwork, the forms, they are all provided by NEBOSH, and I will show you a bit later in the session where you can find them in your course materials. You can either complete the paperwork by handwriting it, so you can print it off and physically handwrite it, or you can use a word processor. I think it's a Word document, and you can type it, save it, and then email it to us. If you handwrite it, then obviously you would need to scan it in and then create an electronic document and then email it into us, into that email address. But you must use the paperwork that's provided. You must use the forms which are available in your online learning materials, in your online learning system. Okay, that's really important because they are NEBOSH forms. Okay, and those forms must be then returned to Astutis by the closing date that I mentioned earlier on. Okay, now the way that the practical, the IG2, NG2 is marked by NEBOSH, okay, you don't get a score, you don't get a mark. All you will get is a pass or if you're unfortunate to get a pass, you will get a refer. So it's not like a written exam where you get a mark 50 out of 100. You just get pass or refer. And another important thing to remember is that all of the requirements that you're expected to achieve, you must get a pass on each element of the assessment. And the way that NEBOSH mark it is they use, as you can see there, what are called minimum criteria. Now I'll show you what these minimum criteria are later, okay? But every minimum criteria must be met. If any of them are not met, then the whole practical, the whole NG2, IG2 assessment is deemed as a refer. So you must get a pass on every one of them to get an overall pass for the assignment, for the practical. Okay, so as an example, pass or refer, as I said, minimum standard to be achieved, we'll have a look at on the next slide. So the next slide will show you the things that NEBOSH use to mark your assessment. And what NEBOSH have provided for us, as you can see on this slide, is examples of where people will have not met the requirements. Okay, so you will be given a not met if you do not include this thing called a methodology. I mentioned it earlier on, the way that you went about doing the risk assessment. If you don't include one of them, it will be not met. Okay, if you only include 9 hazards from 5 hazard categories, you're required to include at least 10 hazards from 5 hazard categories. It will not be met if you do more than 10 hazards, but only from 4 hazard categories. Or if you do 10 hazards, but you do not state which hazard category for all of the hazards that you've identified. Or if you only prioritize 2 actions because you're required to choose and prioritize 3 actions. Or you can get a refer if you don't include how the risk assessment will be communicated, but you say, sorry, it will be included, but you do not say who needs to know the information. So it's really important, as well as you listening carefully during this session, that you also read very carefully the guidance and advice for the NG2 IG2 risk assessment, which we have provided in your learning materials. It is really, really important that you read those things very, very carefully, okay? Because they are there to tell you what you need to include in your risk assessment in order to ensure that every part of your risk assessment receives a pass from NEBOSH. Okay, let's have a look at the minimum marking criteria, the minimum that needs to be achieved in order to achieve a pass. Okay, so as I said, the risk assessment is broken into 4 parts. Okay, the first part is the description, as I said, of the organization and the methodology used, how you did the risk assessment. So as you can see, it says here, the description of the organization, it must be clear and concise so that the examiner is able to understand what types of hazard may be present in the learner's workplace. The description must include, so this is what they're looking for, the name of the organization. You must state the name of the organization. You must say where the organization is located. Where is the site located? A city or a town would be enough. How many workers are employed at that site? Okay, and we'll see a bit later on. Also, you need to say what the typical shift patterns are. In other words, what are the typical hours in the day that people work at that site? Is it 8 a.m. to 5 p.m.? Is it shift patterns in terms of days, afternoons, nights, 6 in the morning till 2 in the afternoon, etc.? You need to state what those shift patterns are. Okay, a general description of the organization that must include the products that are manufactured or the services that are provided, and the types of activities that are undertaken, and there we are, the shift patterns that are worked. And also a description of the area to be included in the risk assessment. So you need to say, these are the activities, this is the area that I've chosen to do the risk assessment, and this is what the area looks like. Okay, you don't have to include drawings or photographs. You just describe the area in words. Okay, to So when the person reads it, they can paint in their mind a picture, an understanding of what that workplace is like. Okay. Another thing there is you don't need to include any other relevant information in the description. As I said, just a description will be enough. And as we can see there, the methodology must include as a minimum sources of information consulted, who you talked to, who you consulted, and how you, the learner, decided on those additional control measures. Okay, I can see that some few people have typed in the chat box. As I said, I will look at the chat box when we have the opportunity for questions. Okay, I want to make sure that we cover everything I need to cover first, and then we'll go to the chat box at question time, and I'll do my best to answer the questions that people have put in there. Okay, so that's part one. Part two, risk assessment. Now, as you can see, it clearly says there must be a minimum of 10 hazards in the risk assessment taken from 5 hazard categories. So the hazard categories are the topics of hazards which are included in your course materials. So as an example, in element 5, you might remember, there are quite a few hazards under I think it's a general heading of psychosocial hazards. Okay, so the hazard categories in element 5 are noise, vibration, radiation, to name 3. So those are the hazard categories. Okay, similarly, in another one of the hazards, workplace issues, there's working at height, there's workplace transport as an example. Those are hazard categories. So you could say in your risk assessment, one hazard category might be noise, and then the hazard that you've identified is the drilling machine is producing a lot of noise when used in the activity. So the hazard is noise from the drilling machine, and the hazard category is noise. Okay, so that must, and I'll show you an example of how to lay out the risk assessment in a moment. So you must include at least 10 hazards from 5 different hazard categories. And you also must ensure that each column of the risk assessment form is completed for every hazard that you've identified. If one of the columns is not applicable, as an example, one of the columns is, are there any existing controls? If there isn't any existing controls, then just write the word none or none in place or not applicable. So every column must have some information in it for every hazard that you've identified. Okay, so as you can see, what needs to go in these columns? Well, we've got the hazard category and the hazard that was found, who might be harmed and how. So you could say the operator using the drilling machine. Remember I said noise. The operator using the drilling machine can be exposed to noise causing deafness. That's enough detail that you need to put in there. So you've said who can be harmed and how they could be harmed from the noise. Then we've got what is already done. What are the existing controls? What is already in place? The next column is what further controls or actions are you recommending? And you see a note there, these must be sensible and proportionate. Okay, so we've said here, these are the existing controls. Next column, these are the additional controls or further controls which I'm recommending. Then we have got the time scales. When should those controls be done? When should they be completed? And then the last one is the role, the job title of the person who should be responsible for completing that action. So if it was, I don't know, let's say with noise, we've established perhaps that there is personal protective equipment available, like hearing protection. And also we've said that that's the only protection that we can give because we can't reduce the amount of noise. We might identify that actually there's hearing protection available, but it's not being worn. So maybe a further control is the person should receive retraining and more supervision to ensure they're wearing hearing protection. And that should be done, as an example, within 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month. And the person responsible perhaps should be the workshop manager. Okay, so the hazard then will follow through with existing controls, further controls, timescales, and who's going to complete that additional control measure. So that is part one and part two. As I said, in a moment, I will show you some worked examples so you can see an example of how to lay out these things. The third part, if you remember, was about the 3 actions which we are recommending. Okay, so what you need to do to complete part 3 is go back and look at the risk assessment and then look at all the further actions, all the recommendations which you've included in that risk assessment, and pick 3, pick the 3 which you think are the most important, which are the urgent ones which needs to be done. Okay, and ideally those should be the ones where you think will be dealing with the highest risk. So you then talk about those 3 recommendations, those 3 actions in part 3. So for each of those 3 actions, you need to give an argument. Okay, you need to talk about why it should be done from a moral point of view. You remember in element 1 of your course, moral, legal, and financial arguments, or drivers, reasons why we should manage health and safety. Okay, and you notice there the legal arguments must be based upon. Now, remember I said this screen is based upon the national certificate. If you're doing the international certificate, then the legal arguments must be based upon either international law, so ILO, International Labour Organization, recommendations or conventions, or they could also be your state or your national legislation that you've got in your area or your country. Okay, and as I said, I can show you how that might be laid out in a moment. So once you've got a discussion around the moral, legal, and financial arguments, then you need to consider the likelihood and probable severity of each action from the hazard category. In other words, you need to say, what is the hazard in terms of, what is the risk in terms of likelihood and consequence that you've already established in the risk assessment. So in other words, we might have said that the noise from the drilling machine is quite high risk because there's a high likelihood that that person could go deaf because they're not wearing their PPE. And if they don't wear it for a very long time, they could actually go quite badly deaf. So that's what we mean by likelihood. What's the chance that that hazard could cause the risk? And if it did happen, how bad could the consequences be, the severity? Okay, and then you need to say what effect the action will have in controlling or reducing the risk. So I can then say, by ensuring that the person is retrained and given a better level of supervision to wear their hearing protection, then this will bring the likelihood of them going deaf down to very unlikely, whereas before it was very likely. Okay, so you need to say, if you like, what the current level of risk is and what the risk will be when the action has been taken, when it's been implemented. So that's part 3. As I said, in a moment, I'll show you the worked example. Okay. Part 4, the very last part then, is the review, check, and communicating. So you must say here when you are going to review the risk assessment, all of the risk assessment. When is it going to be reviewed? And you need to say why you have chosen that date. So you could say, I am intending to review this risk assessment within 3 months, as an example, because I feel the risks are quite high and therefore I want to check that the control measures are working appropriately. Or you might even say, we'll review this risk assessment in 3 months because of the high level of risks, and then we will review it again in 12 months' time, because 12 months is the time period that the organization reviews its risk assessment. So as long as you say why you've chosen that date, that's the important one. You also must say how the risk assessment findings will be communicated and who you are going to communicate the risk assessment to. Okay, so I'm going to communicate them by holding a meeting, and we'll discuss them in the safety meeting. I will also give copies to the director and the senior manager and the supervisor, and I will have a meeting with them to explain what the findings were. And you also then, the last one, you then must show or indicate how you will follow up on the risk assessment to check that the actions have been carried out. So you could say we will review them in the safety meeting, which happens every month or every 3 months. And they will remain in the safety meeting until all the actions have been completed. Again, I'm just giving you examples of what we mean by these things that you can see on the slide. As I said, in a moment, I'll start showing you some worked examples of what it physically looks like. Okay, so we've come to a little break in proceedings. Before I get any questions verbally, let me just go back to some of the questions which were included in the chat box. So there's a question here. Someone says, I'm not working for quite a few months now. How can I fulfill this part? Well, there's a potential problem there, isn't it? Because you need to be doing the risk assessment in a workplace. Okay, so what you really should be doing is going to a workplace. So if you can't get to your own workplace, then you may be able to go to another workplace or go to a friend's workplace, or maybe even someone that you know will enable you to go to where they work. Okay, you could do it on a previous project, yes, but you've got to make sure that if you're using a previous project, that you fulfill all the things that we've just talked about. Okay, so you've got to make sure you complete all those 4 sections. We'll look at them in a little bit more detail. Okay, if you're not sure whether you'll be able to do that from memory, then you might need to wait until you can get to a workplace to do your practical assignment in. All right. What if the person attending the NEBOSH is just a student and didn't work so far? How can he complete the task given the name of the company? Well, again, if you're not in work and you're a student, what you need to do is to find somewhere that you can do the risk assessment. Now, it doesn't have to be a factory. It could actually be a college. It could be a university. It could be a shop on the high street. It could be a friend's garage that they do for servicing. Okay, it doesn't have to be what we sometimes call a traditional organization, a factory. It can be anywhere. All right, so if you're not working at the moment and you're a student, what you need to do is try and talk to some of your friends, some people that you know, maybe some family members, and say to them, is it possible that I can come to your place where you work or where you carry out your tasks and do my risk assessment? Yeah, explain to them that it's only for your qualification. You know, nobody will be going into that workplace and checking that what they're doing is correct. It is purely what we call an academic exercise. Okay, but you do need to be able to go into a workplace to do this work. Okay, so you need to think about very carefully, who can I talk to? Where can I go to actually do this work? And as I said, it could be a college, a university, it could be a shop on the high street, could be a restaurant that somebody runs that you know, and you could go in and do the risk assessment there. Can we just ask the subcontractor to replace the original labor with a more qualified one just to make sure that the work process? Yes, if that's what you're talking about in terms of a control measure, then if you feel if the work is being done by a contractor, that the contractor is not behaving safely, then a recommendation could be, I think we need to change the contractor, or we need to bring a different employee in to do this work. Okay, but what you want to really do, what you really want to do is just to look at an activity which is going on, and then identify the risks from either one activity or 2 activities that are currently happening, because you should be able then to pick up quite a few hazards there in those processes. Again, it doesn't have to be one activity. It can be 2, it could be 3 activities that you're watching. As long as you describe in part 1, these are the activities that were going on in that area, that should be fine. Okay. Yes, you can submit the NG2, IG2 practical before the date that you've been given. That's not a problem. Okay. Once you've been given a date, that date is the deadline, the very last day that you can submit it. You can submit it before then if you wish. Okay. Okay. Yeah, the risk assessment that you produce, it might be very similar to a risk assessment you've already got in your workplace. Doesn't matter. Okay. What you have to do is produce a risk assessment in the same format that NEBOSH have laid down in the forms that we're going to have a look at in a moment. Okay. So it doesn't matter whether you've already got similar risk assessments in your workplace. NEBOSH are not going to know that. All they're interested in is this is your risk assessment and you've completed it using the right forms and you've filled everything in the right way. So that's fine. Okay. So if that's how you communicate your findings, then write that in your risk assessment.
Right, Andrew. Andrew, sorry for it takes too long for me to just write down some questions, but it looks like some of it are possible and some of it are not possible. I mean, I've been doing my job for the past 29 years in construction business, being a contractor. As you well know, we've got the construction business industry has some problems regard to COVID, pandemic, IR35 contractors, and so on.
Yeah.
So as you can see, I already told you that for nearly a year, I only have a couple of weeks, work, and then the pandemic comes around, nothing. So to do and go into one place, like if someone will knock on my door, say, can I come with you and do a risk assessment based on, I will never accept it. So I do not know how do you expect me to go somewhere, even to one of my colleagues, and to do that, because nobody will accept that, to be honest. I would not accept no one from outside the company to come and do a risk assessment, no matter for what reason, unless it's been, recommended or sent by the director.
Okay.
And with his approval.
Okay, I understand.
So that will contravene to whatever, the NEBOSH is requesting, and is not going to be achievable from this point of view. I'm telling you for sure.
Okay.
At this moment in time, that is one thing.
Okay.
So I would like you to respond to that question. Second, I can produce any risk assessment that the NEBOSH is requiring as per different companies that I've been working with, but producing one of my own as being a health and safety advisor from then on. Let's put it this way, yeah?
Okay.
Right. In respect of this matter, I do agree with everything you said. Into the real world, we will just move from left to right. I agree with the 12 months that has to be renewed. There are risk assessments that are done pretty much on, let's put it this way, site-specific or job-specific.
Yeah.
That will surpass the general risk assessment of the company.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that will be carried out by the site manager, supervision, project manager, whoever will be, responsible for that. That's before the general health and safety or HSE of the company will come and assess himself. That is not going to be achievable, on a high level. So pretty much is done on site, but the level of the supervision provided within that company. I'm talking about main contractors. I've been only working for the main contractors, never worked for the subcontractor.
Okay,
right?
That's okay. Yeah.
So
Okay.
now there are two questions. The reason I split it in two is just because from the subcontractor point of view, they will have to come to me. And obviously as a main contractor, I can give guidance and what I expect to be done. Yeah. So from both point of view, we have to present it, or from the subcontractor or contractor point of view.
Right. Okay.
That is another question. Now,
so can I answer the questions that you've already asked me first?
Okay, no problem.
Okay. Yeah. Now, regards access to a workplace, I fully understand the circumstances that people are in at the moment, and with some people, quite a lot of people, it will be very difficult. So if you haven't got access to a workplace and you're not able to access a workplace, then the only thing I can recommend that you do, and remember, this is not Astutus's rules, these are NEBOSH's rules, okay?
Yes,
is that you try and complete the risk assessment from your memory.
Yeah, that will be a problem.
The only thing.
It has to be within the site, like live. You understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, okay. Okay, so what you will have to do then is you'll have to think about and remember typical activities that you're familiar with on your construction sites, and then describe maybe a past site that you've visited or you've been working on or you've had others working on. Describe that site from your memory, and then think about the activities that are happening there, and then from your memory again, apply the risk assessment to those activities. Okay. Now, it doesn't matter whether you're the main contractor or whether you're a subcontractor. Okay,
Right.
where you can tell NEBOSH whether you're the main contractor or a subcontractor is in part 1 in the introduction. So you,
The reason I was asking, sorry, just to interrupt
yeah,
you for a minute. The reason I was splitting into subcontractors and contractors, as you well know, some of the incoming level is spent on obviously HSE, yeah.
yeah,
So subcontractors are trying to spend as less as possible to, have an increased income. Yeah, spend as less as possible on health and safety measures.
yeah, okay, right. So
That's
that's
why they come with a generic pretty much always for the main
right.
contractor. Yeah.
Okay,
And then we will have to pick it up according to the task specific and
okay,
try to enforce as it should.
okay. I
That's
appreciate
why I
that.
said we have to present it from the subcontractor point of view, contractor, or both, or
Right.
general.
It can be a general one. What I would probably do is to keep things simple, okay? Because it doesn't have to be complicated. And remember, it is just an academic exercise. All right. What I would suggest that you do is imagine that you are the contractor that is doing the work on the site, because it'll be nice and
Okay.
simple then. And then you can think about the activities, and then you can think about, well, typically this is what they would do in this situation. So that's the existing controls. However, I think we can do these as well. That would be your further controls. Okay. So all you're
Really
trying,
appreciate it.
that's okay. All you're trying to do is to demonstrate to NEBOSH that you can do a risk assessment. That's really the purpose of the exercise. So don't try and make it too complicated. Keep it as simple as possible. Okay. What I will do in a moment is I will show you the parts, part 1 to 4, and I will show you the completed forms, so you can see how much detail you need to go into. And also,
Are we doing words with regard to this matter?
yeah, there is words. I'll come to that later.
All right.
And I will also show you in your learning materials where you can get the worked example, so you can use it to follow it, to understand how much detail you need to put into it. Okay.
You're a star, Andrew. Thank you very
Okay,
much.
so
You clarified pretty much
that's
most
okay.
of my-
So I'm sure some of the questions you may have may well be answered later on in the session. Okay.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Okay, no problem. No, there's just a couple of other questions. There's no minimum as to how many controls you can list, as long as they're appropriate for each of the hazards and risks that you've identified. The organization, can the organization be anonymous? Yes and no. Let me explain what I mean by that. If you don't want to put the actual name in the assessment, you can change the name of the company. Okay, so as an example, let's say I was doing a risk assessment in the Astutis business. If I didn't want to use the word Astutis, I could say the company is called ABC Training Limited, and I could put bracket then name changed, or name changed to protect the name, or name changed on request. So as long as you say in your part 1 of the assessment, this is the company name, and then put brackets, the name has been changed, that's fine. But you must have a company name. You can't say the name of the company is anonymous or is being withheld. You've got to put a name in there. But what you can do is you can make the name up. It can be fictitious, and then put in brackets to say the name of the company is being changed. Okay, must the activities be in the same location? No, they don't. So as long as you describe the locations that you've chosen, so you could say the company manufactures this, that, and that. It's got an office, it's got a warehouse, it's got a workshop. I've chosen the warehouse and the workshop for this risk assessment, and the activities that are carried out in the workshop are these, and the activities that are carried out in the warehouse are these. So as long as you talk about those clearly in part 1, then that will be fine. The reader, then the examiner, will understand, and then what you've done then in the risk assessment part 2 will make sense. Okay, so I've said, can the organization be anonymous? On the risk assessment as part of 10, can I pick 3 hazards from one? Yes, you can pick 3 hazards from one category. Okay, so you've got to get 10 hazards, but you must ensure that you've got at least 5 hazard categories. So as an example, you could have 10 hazards, but they all might come from noise, vibration, hazardous substances, workplace transport, and radiation. Just made them up. Okay, So there's only 5 hazard categories there, but you could have 2 from there, 3 from that one, 1 from that one, 3 from that one, and the rest from that one. Yeah, you can. So you can split them up as you would need to, but you must have at least 10 individual hazards, and it must be from at least 5 hazard categories. That's the rule. Yes, there is a template for the risk assessment. I'll show you that in a moment, and I'll show you where you can use it. You must use the NEBOSH one. Right, you can include COVID as a hazard, okay? But remember, it will only be one hazard in your risk assessment. And the group, the hazard category that it will come from will be hazardous substances, bracket biological, because COVID is a virus, isn't it? So bacteria, viruses, spores, etc. are all biological hazards. But your risk assessment should not be all about COVID and nothing else. COVID will just be one hazard out of your 10 that you've chosen, and the hazard category would be biological hazardous substances. Okay. A company assessing only an employee being employed. Okay. Right, it shouldn't be a problem if you haven't got permanent employees. So the way to come around that is if you can think about and select an activity where you've had to bring almost subcontractors, aren't there? You've brought the labor in, then describe where that activity is happening. It might be on another person's or another company, another company's site, as long as you describe that, okay? And then you can talk about the location, the area, and the activities. They don't have to be your employees. That's fine. They don't have to be your permanent employees. Right, okay. You're not assigned a supervisor to do this project. The project you do in your own time. The only deadline is that you must send it to us by email by that date which you've been given. So it doesn't need to be supervised. You don't have to send it to anyone to check either, okay? I'll mention this a bit later on, learning providers, Astutis included, is not allowed to pre-read or pre-mark any of your assignments, but we are allowed to give you guidance, and this webinar is the guidance that we're allowed to give you. But as I said in a moment, I will show you not only what the forms look like, but also where you can find them in your learning materials, and also what a completed one looks like, so you can use that as a guide, okay? And I will also tell you how and where you can submit it. I'll show you where you can find that in your learning materials, and also I'll give you the email address a little bit later. Okay, there's lots of questions in the chat box, so please bear with me. Yeah, I think we've talked about I don't have a place to do the assessment. I think we've talked about that. You'll either have to find one or you'll have to do it from memory. You could do it in your apartment or your residence, but you've got to make sure you can identify at least 10 hazards from 5 different categories. Okay, so the activity would be working from home, and you'd have to describe the type of work. You could do it from your home, but you need to make sure that you've got enough hazards there. So you could include obviously the kitchen arrangements, the toilet arrangements you've got in your home, making a cup of tea, having a lunch break, etc., as well as working wherever you're working and doing your work, whether it's computer work or whatever it might be. Right, it can take several weeks. I think it's about as many as 14 weeks for the results to come back, 2 to 3 months. That's not us, that's NEBOSH. So you'll just have to be patient with us and NEBOSH after you've submitted it for your results to come back. Okay. How close to the submission deadline can I register for the exam? You should be registering, if you haven't already done so, you should be contacting us, and I'll show you how to do that later. Now, basically. So if you're planning to submit your risk assessment this month, I think there's a date in about 2 weeks' time. You need to start registering now. Okay. If you're not hurried, if you don't mind waiting a little while, then again, I can show you how to register, where you need to go to register, and then you will be given dates that you can choose from to submit. I think, I might not be completely correct here, but I think it's like every 2 months there's dates available. but I'll show you how to find out about that. And then our admin people, our exam administration people, can then let you know about the dates that are available for you to submit. That's fine. Yeah, if you paid for it but you haven't chosen a date, then that's fine. Remember, there are two what you might call exams. There's the NG1 open book exam, and there's the NG2 risk assessment practical exam, and that's what we're talking about now. It's the NG2. There's two exams, as I said. They are looked at separately, so you need to pass both. You need to pass the OBE, the open book exam NG1 or IG1, and you also need to pass this, the NG2, the risk assessment. Okay, failing either of them or being referred on either of them, you will not get the qualification. You need to pass both of them separately. Okay, right. So if there aren't any more questions, let's move on then and have a look at, I've mentioned this next thing, what support can you get? Well, I'll show you in the learning materials where you can find completed assessments and also where you can find advice and guidance. Okay, this is the teaching time that we are making available to explain the assessment requirements to our online learners. It's through these webinars. Okay, remember that even though that we talk you through this, and I can show you in your online learning materials where the worked examples are provided by NEBOSH, the risk assessment must be your own work. Excuse me a moment. So you must not copy. Okay, you must not copy the risk assessment. It must be your own work. I can see there's some questions coming in the chat box. If I can, and if you will allow me, I will answer those when we get to the next question session, if that's okay. Okay, so tutors, me and others in Astutus, we must not read or amend any drafts of your practical, and we must not pre-mark. Okay, so please do not send in your practical to us and say, please, can you have a look at this and tell me if it's going to be a pass? We are not allowed to do that. Okay, I must emphasize that we are not allowed to do it. Yeah, we can give you advice if you've got any specific questions. As an example, I've identified this particular hazard, but I'm not sure which hazard category it belongs to. We can provide answer to that question, but we can't answer a question which would be something like, here's my section, here's my part 2, my risk assessment. Can you tell me whether it would pass or not? We cannot do that. So please don't ask us to. Okay, but in a moment, I will show you where you can find the advice, where you can find the guidance, where you can find the completed example that you can follow as a template, as a format. Okay, so the online resources that we've got are in your learning materials. Now, this slide, I know it's a little bit small, this slide shows you the front page, if you like, of your course. Okay, what you've basically got is you've got the course content, which is the list. We couldn't fit it all onto the one slide, so we've put it onto two. So you've got the list, okay, and you've also got an area of resources. Okay, now the guidance for the practical, for the NG-IG2 practical, is actually at the bottom of the page. Okay, so if I just go back, you can see it says practical application. And if we look at that closer or more closely, okay, this is what it looks like. And you can see it says General Certificate Practical Application Guidance. And obviously this is the webinar. So what you need to do is you need to click on that little box there, and then that will open up the section of the guidance, okay, which will look like this. And then what you need to do is you need to click on this particular box, which says General Certificate Practical Application Astutis Guidance. But you can also see there, it says register to submit your practical. But this is where you'll find the guidance. Now, if you also look on this slide, you will also see, as well as this link, you will see an area up here, a tab, resources, and you will also see some more resources on the right-hand side. Now, I know it's a little bit small, but clicking on that first one, it will take you to an online blog. We've got advice on how to complete the practical in a blog format on one of our web pages. And also you can see there's examples. This is where you can find the example NGIG2 submission. So if you click on that one, which says example, what you can then get, and you can download it, is a completed example of what a practical risk assessment would look like. And I'll show you some of that content in a moment. You've also got a very useful checklist, which you can download. This checklist, it is, as it says, it's a checklist. So it will say, have you done this? Have you done that? And you can tick them off and say, yeah, I've done that, I've done that, I've done that. So it's a good way of making sure that you've included everything that you need to include. As you can see, I can see there's some more questions coming into the chat box. I'll answer those when we get to a question session, if that's okay. And then also, you can see the forms, which you can click on and download. There's one for an electronic submission, and there's also one that you can print off and you can handwrite, and then you'd have to scan that in and then email it to us. Okay, so you can either get to those resources either by clicking on any of them on the right-hand side here, or you can actually click on this tab here and that will list them on the page that opens up. So if we imagine now that we've clicked on this section, the Astutis guidance, this will then show you this screen. Okay, now you should be familiar with this because this is the way that the learning materials for the course are presented. They're laid out in this manner. The first thing you'll see there is a little animation. So if you click on that, it will play it and you can listen to it, and it takes you through what's required. Okay, and obviously then by also clicking here on this arrow, it will then take you through the 6 pages, which will give you all the guidance that you need. Okay, if I just go back for a moment and again mention the resources. Remember I mentioned this earlier on there, the resources tab. Well, there it is. Okay, and then when you click on that, as I said, you will then see all of those resources, which also appear again on the right-hand side. Okay, so there's lots of guidance. There's lots of, there's a couple of blogs we've written. You know, there's an example, as you can see there, of a risk assessment, which you can follow the same format as a checklist. So that's where you can find all of the information that you need to support you when you need to complete the practical. Okay, so there's a couple of questions that I've noticed in the chat box. Just bear with me a moment while I go and answer some of these, if you would. Okay. So there's someone here that's planning to do the next exam, the OBE exam in February. That's fine. Okay. Now, again, you don't get a learning supervisor. Okay. There is what is called online support. Safety advisor at astutis.com is the online support. So if you, and you should be able to see this anyway in your learning materials. Okay, there is information right at the start of the course, which is information about the course and how you can get help. So safety advisor at astutis.com is where you can look for technical help. Okay, and also we will be running, and we have run them in the past, a series of webinars to help you prepare for the open book exams. Okay. You should be able to see in your learning materials in that list that I saw at the front of the course. If I just take you back a couple of slides, okay, remember this one? Okay, just as just as you enrolled to come on this webinar, there are other webinars which you can't see at the moment on here for the OBE. So if you register for that one, we will then send you an invite and a link so you can come to the OBE webinar to get some support for that. Okay. The registration deadline for February, again, what you need to do is to register for the exam, and the link to register the exam is actually at the top of your learning content page. I think it's just after the overview. So if you click on that, I think it says registering for NGIG1 exam and practical. If you click on that, fill in the form, and then someone will contact you via email and they'll say, this is the next exam that's running. Do you wish to register for it? And you register for it, and then they will send you confirmation. Okay, so if you're planning to do the exam in February, go through that route and you should be able then to register for it, or at least they will let you know when you can register for it, because it might not be available yet. Yes, you do. So if you register for the OBE exam, the open book exam, the IG1, you need to register separately for this NGIG2 for the practical. So there's 2 registrations which you need to register for. Okay, so again, if you follow the same link, you follow the same route as you use to register for the OBE, then say, I want to register for the practical, and then they will give you information in the same way that you registered for the OBE. If you've tried that and you've got problems, it doesn't seem to work, it should work, but if it doesn't, then remember those 2 help emails that you've got, okay? Safety advisor, but the one that you want, if you've got problems registering, is learning advisor @astutis.com. And they can advise you, or they can forward your email to one of our registration team, and then they can contact you. But you should be able to use the links in your learning materials to complete the form, which is online, and then they will come back to you and give you the dates that are available. All right. So yes, you do need to register for them separately. When can you register to submit the practical? You can register at any time. Okay. So all you need to do is to go through that route and register. You will be then instructed about what dates are available, and then you can choose one of those dates and then obviously submit your practical by that date. I'm not quite sure what this question means. What questions get asked in Viva? I'm not sure what you mean by Viva. If you can explain to me in the chat box what you mean by that. I don't understand.
Hi, Andrew. It was my question.
Okay.
Viva, it's after the OB exams, the 1-to-1 session that we will have.
Ah, right. Okay. All that is, it's an interview really. Just to confirm that it was actually you that sat the exam. Now, you won't be asked any specific questions about the answers that you wrote. So they're not going to say to you, as an example, task number 4 was this. What did you write? Okay. They're not expecting you to remember all of your answers that you did for the OBE, but they'll ask you general questions. They might ask you, as an example, which question, an answer that you gave, which one do you think you could apply best in your workplace? Or question 4 was about whatever it was about. How do you think your workplace compares to this? So all it's really is to engage with you, to actually check that it's you. Okay. But I'm sure you've been told in the information that you've been given about that online interview is that you need to have photographic identification as well. Okay, and you'll be given a time slot. So I wouldn't worry about that interview. It's not an interview as such. You don't have to remember what you've written and what your answers were. It's just to make sure some general questions that they will ask you. The questions they ask you are actually set by NEBOSH. So it means that the person who is interviewing, they will ask the same questions to everyone. Okay?
Thanks, Andrew. So more or less, these questions would be surrounding from the examination paper that we got.
Yes, yeah. But as I said, they won't be asking you to tell them how you answered the particular task, but they will be based around the scenario which you had in the exam. But
Sounds good. Thank you.
They won't be technical questions. Okay, no problem.
Thanks, Andrew.
Right, if you pass the NG, well, your overall mark, right, okay. So for the open book exam, which is the NG-IG1, you will actually get a mark for that. So you could, 50%, 60%, 70%, okay? For this, what we're talking about today, the NG2, you don't get a mark, you just get a pass. So you need to pass both. You need to pass the written exam and the risk assessment. And then your overall mark that you get will be based upon your open book examination mark. So for example, if you had 70%, I think let's say 65% in your OBE, and you pass the practical, you would then have your qualification. Your qualification would be the international or national certificate pass with credit, because if I remember correctly, I think 65% is in the area where you can get a credit. It's more than a pass. But if you only had, let's say, 50%, which is still a pass, and you pass the NG2, you would then get the qualification pass. Okay, so the actual grade that you get is just based upon the first exam, which is the written open book OBE exam. Right, now in terms of the fees, you will need to check with the registration person that sends you the email when you request to be registered. Okay, some people pay for it up front in the course, other people pay for it when they need to sit it. Okay, so I can't say whether an individual would need to pay or not, but you will be advised by the person that contacts you as to whether there's an extra fee to pay or whether it's already been paid. So I can't answer that question, I'm afraid, at this point. Yeah, if you submitted your OBE exam 6 minutes late, okay, then I don't know, but it might be that the actual window on the porthole on the NIBOSH website may have been closed. However, if when you submitted it, you saw a message which said your answers have been successfully submitted, then quite possibly they've allowed that to happen. They've allowed you to submit it. I understand this week when the OBE happened, I think there was a problem with their system. Okay, so this week they may have been a little bit more flexible in terms of allowing people to submit it. Okay, so if you saw a sign or a message on the screen after you submitted it said your assignment has been successfully submitted, I would personally say it's been submitted and it's been accepted. Okay, but normally when they say you have to submit it by a certain time, it means it has to be submitted by a certain time. Otherwise, they're quite likely to say, sorry, but you missed the window. So I can't really give you the answer there because I'm not NIBOSH, but that's my thoughts on it. Yeah, if you've booked your interview, that's fine. That's not a problem. I don't know what the time slots are for the interviews. You will have to do that. I think, if I remember correctly, they are all based on UK time. Okay, so you'll have to pick one which is convenient for you. When you go to the interview meeting online, you do need to have photographic ID. So there needs to be a passport or a driving license with a photograph on. Yes, you do need photographic ID. What's the pass mark of the OBE? I believe it's 45%. Okay, I think the last one was. Your certificate, NIBOSH certificate, doesn't expire. Once you've got it, you've got it. Yeah, you did get enough extra time yesterday, I believe, because there was problems. So they extended the window for it to be done. Okay, there's an answer there in terms of the fees. I don't know what the fees are. I'm not involved in that area. You'd have to contact the email addresses of the people that confirmed your registrations, etc. Okay. Okay, good. So having said all of that then, at the expense or making sure that we stay on track, let's get to where we finished. And now what we'll do is look at the stages of the risk assessment in more detail. Okay, so as we said earlier on, these are the 4 stages. So what we're going to do first of all is we're going to look at stage 1, the background and the description and the methodology. Okay, so as I said, you must use the forms that are provided, part 1. I've shown you earlier on where you can download those forms in your learning material. And as I said, part 1 needs to have the name of the organization. Okay, you can make up the name, but you need to have a name and you then need to put in brackets, name has been changed. You need to say where it is based, what town, what city, what area, okay? You don't have to give the full address, 29 Great Britain Street, whatever it is, but it's just say, I know, London or Southeast London, just using cities that probably most of you have heard of, okay? As long as they roughly know where the site is based. How many workers are employed at that site? A general description of the company, the organization, a description of the area that you're doing the risk assessment, and obviously listing the activities that are happening in that area, and obviously any other relevant information. But as I said, you don't need to include any photographs or any drawings or any diagrams. Okay, so as I said earlier on, in your learning materials, there is a worked example of an NGIG risk assessment. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you part 1 of that worked example, so you can see how it's laid out, what kind of information would be expected to be included. Excuse me. Okay, I know it's a little bit small, but what you'll have on the form is you will have, as you can see in the shaded yellow areas, what you have to put in each of these boxes and a rough guide as to how many words you should include. Now, the word count. There is no maximum and there is no minimum. It is just a guide. What they're saying is it should be around 150 to 200 words. If you, in this particular section, if you went up to 250, 300 words, you're not going to lose any marks, okay? It's just giving you a guide to say, this is the kind of quantity of words that we're expected to see, just to give you a guide, okay? So don't worry too much if you're slightly under 200 or you're slightly over. As long as you're in that rough area, it will be fine. Okay, let's have a look at what they've got on the form. As you can see, so they've said the organization, my organization, National General Garage Limited, known as NGG Limited, based in Leicestershire and employs 24 workers. So they've said where it is, they've given the name, they've said the number of people. Okay, it's a medium-sized garage with offices, a vehicle repair shop, and a paint spraying booth. The business does a lot of repairs and maintenance on commercial vehicles and body repairs, mainly cars and vans. That have been involved in accidents for insurance companies. Servicing and MOTs are carried out for members of the public. Typical activities undertaken include moving spare parts from the stores to the workshop, engine repairs, activities and servicing, body repairs. So you can see they've listed the activities. It operates between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. So there's your shifts, okay? It's closed at weekends. Workers are not required to work 7 hours a day, only required, sorry. And so there are staggered start and finish times between the 8 and 6. Okay, the risk assessment will cover the garage and the spray booth activities. The office area has a separate risk assessment. The finance director reports directly to the managing director, has direct responsible for health and safety. So within that short description, they've talked about the place, they've given the name where it is, what the company does, the number of employees, the shift patterns, and the activities. Okay. This area is about how they went about doing the risk assessment. Again, approximately 200 words. So they started looking up references to good practice relating to the organization. The HSE's website had lots of resources, for example, health and safety in motor vehicle repair. That's useful because that's the industry that they're in. That's what they actually do as a business. And they then put the reference number to it is HSG 261. And they've also put the web page where they found it. And that was a good source of information. After looking at source information, I then went around the workshop and talked to people who were doing the job. They gave me information that wasn't obvious from a visual inspection. For example, a lot of workers didn't know that there were dust masks available for the reasons or the reasons why they should be worn. I also checked the accident book to see what types of incidents had occurred over the last 12 months and whether these incidents were reoccurring. I also checked the reasons for sickness absence again, to see if there were any recurring themes for ill health. Oh, beg my pardon. Okay, so as you can see, they've said that document was a very good source of information. what I would probably put in addition to this, I would probably say it was this document I also referred to when deciding what further controls should be put in place. So as you can see, it's a very short summary of what they did when they carried out the risk assessment. Okay, now, what do we need as a minimum for this section to pass? We've already mentioned this, you will recall. Okay, the description of the workplace and the organization, clear and concise, so that the person reading it, the examiner, can understand the hazards that might be present. It must include the name, the location, how many are employed, general description of activities and what they do, as well as the shift patterns. Okay, a description of the area to be concluded. Yeah, and the learner does not have to include any relevant information. A valid question there, so I will answer it. There's a learning number on the top right-hand side. Yeah, your learning number here is the number that you've been given from NEBOSH. All right. Now, if you haven't got that number yet, don't worry about it. But it comes from NEBOSH. All right. So when you register, when we register you with NEBOSH, you will be given a particular number. Normally, they start with a couple of zeros, 00, and then probably 4 or 5 numbers. That's the number that you put in there. All right. And that number is specific to you. Okay. Yeah, and then the methodology, how you went about, what sources of information you consulted, who was consulted, how the learner decided on additional control measures. Yes, and the number is exactly the same for IG1 and IG2. That number is you. You are recognized in the NEBOSH system as a number. So whenever you turn up for an exam or you register for an exam, you use exactly the same number. It's your number that you've been allocated. Okay, so that's the first bit. Okay, and as I said, I've shown you earlier where you can find this worked example in your online learning materials. Remember, it was in that resources area when you look at the guidance for the practical, the NG-IG2. Okay, the second part is the actual risk assessment. So again, you must use the table in part 2 of the forms, and you must identify 10 different hazards from at least 5 different hazard categories. And you can see we've got a couple of examples there: fire, manual handling, etc. Okay, so you've got the elements of the course 5 to 11. Okay, the hazard categories are the individual groups of hazards in elements 5 to 11. So as an example, I said element 5 was a topic, and I think it was psychosocial hazards, I think it was, but that was the element that had the hazards of noise, vibration, radiation. I think lone working was in there as well. I think stress was in there. Okay, so all of those are hazard categories. So in element 5, you've got probably 3 or 4 hazard categories. Okay, there's another one, I think workplace hazards is another heading, and there's several more hazard categories in there. Work at height, slips and trips. I think, what else is in there off the top of my head? I think welfare is in there as well. Okay, so what we mean by hazard categories are the topics that are contained in elements 5 to 11. 5 to 11. All right, so let's have a look at how that might be laid out on part 2, the risk assessment. Now, I'm not going to show you all of the risk assessment, the worked example. I'm just going to show you the first part of it. So with this one, okay, you can see that this is the form, part 2. All right, you can see again your learner number, the organization name, the date that you did the risk assessment, and the scope of the risk assessment. In other words, the areas where you carried out the risk assessment. And here's an example. So they've got the hazard category first is hazardous substances, and the actual hazard is dust, high concentration of processed dust within the workshop and spray booth. Okay. Then they've said who might be harmed. So what they've done is they said all workers, customers, and others visiting the organization, and they've said how. So high concentrations of processed dust are always present from the routine and frequent activities. Since there is no dust extraction, people breathe in the hazardous dust, which could cause short-term irritation and long-term serious health conditions. People can also get the irritant dust on their skin. So they've included in the how bit the inhalation route and also the possible absorption route in terms of absorbing it onto the skin. So it can get on the skin, which can cause dermatitis. They could get it into their eyes, which could cause irritation, or even, I think it actually says further on, more serious injury. All right, so you can see there they've said who could be harmed and how. Okay, so just a question there. We're looking at about 27 hazard categories. I've not physically counted them, but there might well be 27 when you actually break them down, because there's more than one hazard category in each element 5 to 11. Okay, so whatever the topics are, that's the hazard categories which would go in this position here, hazardous substances being one of them. I think hazardous substances are actually broken down into two. So you've got chemicals and you've also got biological hazardous substances. Okay, so just coming back to the form then. So they've said who could be harmed and how. We've now got the next column. What are you already doing? So they've said they've got dilution ventilation in place, and they've also got dust masks are available, but it is not mandatory. It's not forcible, if you like. They're not making it the law that they have to be worn, but they are available for people to wear. So what they've said here, and as I mentioned earlier on, this is not the full page. This is just one part of it, because when you see the worked example that you can download, there are more than 6 recommendations. There's actually 16 actually recommendations in this for this dust hazard. Okay, so sometimes it's a good idea to number them so you can then allocate the further control to the right person. So we've just shown you a little section of it. So they've said enclosed area to be set up for sanding and grinding, including dust. Including that will include a suitable local exhaust ventilation system, purchase of what's called an on-tool dust extraction system, use of face masks. You can see the information there. And then they've allocated a suitable time scale against each recommendation. And then they've got the 3 people that are involved, the workshop manager, the finance director, and the stores manager. And they've listed against them which actions they should be responsible for. Okay. Is it okay to use the actual risk assessment for the organization that you... yeah, you could do. Yeah, you could say, I also looked at existing risk assessments that were already in place in the organization. That's fine. You're talking about the methodology section, I'm assuming there. So yeah, you can use it. You can refer to it. However, make sure that when you do the risk assessment for the practical, you use this form. You don't use your company's form. Okay, it must be this one. But you could look at, and you can talk about anything that you've looked at, whether it's procedures, existing risk assessments, site rules, whatever it is. Okay, so there's just an example. As I said, if you later, if you go to your online learning materials and find, as I showed you earlier, the worked example and download it, you will see the whole risk assessment where they've included all 10 hazards, and you can see the types of things that they talk about. And you can see also how they've laid it out, how they've completed the form. So the marking criteria, if we do, yeah, you can just put it in the methodology place, what documents you looked at. You could say, I also referred to the company's risk assessments, and just leave it at that. And that would be in the methodology section, which is part 1, the second box after you've described the organization. Okay, so the marking criteria for this bit then, part 2. Okay, so you need to ensure that you've got at least 10 hazards taken from at least 5 hazard categories. Okay, each column in the table must be completed. Yeah, once you've got the qualification, the NEBOSH certificate, it is valid for life. You don't need to resit or restudy. Once you've got it, you've got it. Yeah, I did mine nearly 30 years ago. Yeah, and mine's still valid. Okay, so each table must be completed. So you must ensure you've got the hazard category and the hazard. You must say who could be harmed and how. You must say what existing controls there are. If there isn't any in place, just write none. Don't leave it blank. What further controls are required? Making sure obviously they're sensible and proportionate. Remember also from your studies, the hierarchy of control. So they would be looking for you to apply that hierarchy so that it's sensible and it's the right control measure. Okay. Upgrade the qualification. Not sure what you mean by that. If you had a pass and you wanted to get a distinction, you would have to resit the exams, but it's not worth doing that. Just get the pass. And then if you want to go on and do the diploma, you've got the certificate, which will enable you then to go on and study further. Okay. So if you wouldn't mind, if we can leave those questions until the end, I'd appreciate that. Yeah, let's concentrate on the practical for now if we can. Okay, and the job person, so the timescales for the implementation of the controls and the job role of the person responsible for each of those recommendations. Okay, so that's the second bit, yeah, the risk assessment. Okay, the third bit is the actions. So what you need to do in the third bit is you need to go back and have a look through part 2, have a look through the risk assessment that you've done and select 3 actions from that risk assessment which you think are the most important. They're the most urgent. Yeah, they deal with the biggest risks in that risk assessment. And you then need to complete the form for part 3 by justifying why these are important and why they need to be actioned. Okay, so as you can see, moral, legal, and financial argument. Yeah, we must consider the likelihood and probable severity of the risk that these actions are trying to deal with. And also you need to state how effective each action will be if they're implemented. In other words, how much will it bring the likelihood and consequence of the risk down by if we actually implement that recommendation. Okay, including the justification for the timescales. You can say, I've chosen the reason why I've said this action needs to be completed in 2 months is because it is a high risk, but it needs design and also there needs to be things manufactured. So therefore 2 months I believe is appropriate. So it's not just saying it needs to be done in 2 months. You need to say why you've chosen that timescale, 2 months or whatever it might be. Okay, and whether you think the action will fully control the risk. In other words, say it will bring the risk down to a lower level, but there's still a residual risk there which people need to be aware of. And that's why they have existing personal protective equipment or whatever it might be. So you need to comment on whether there's any residual risk left if the action is implemented. Okay, so again, let's have a look at the worked example. All right, so this is what part 3 looks like in that worked example. And this is spread over a couple of slides. So this is the area where probably you're going to write the most. Because as you can see, it talks about the justification, the moral, legal, and financial between 500 and 700 words. Then the consideration of likelihood and probable severity, 150 to 250 words. And then the description of how effective the action is likely to be in controlling the risk, 250 to 350 words. So there's quite a bit that you need to talk about here. So the first bit is the moral, legal, and financial. First of all, we state what the actions are, okay? Not what the risk is that we're controlling the risk from, what the actions are. So the action 1 in their risk assessment is they said we need to purchase a mobile bridge. So it's a bridge they can move to allow mechanics to be able to safely access both sides of the inspection pit. Remember, it was in a garage, in a car vehicle garage when working at ground level. And the hazard category there was working at height. In other words, they've identified that for people to get from one side of the workshop to the other, they're jumping across the pit, which is in the floor. So they're saying here, we need a mobile bridge that we can put across it so that people can walk across the pit rather than jumping across it. Okay, yeah, I'll come back to your question in a moment if I can. So that's the first prioritize that they've said, the first action. The second action, enclosed area to be set up for the sanding and grinding operations, including that will include a suitable local exhaust ventilation system. and the hazard category there is hazard substance. You remember we saw that in the worked example previously. So that's the second action. And the third action, again, one that we saw, purchase of an on-tool dust extraction system, and the hazardous category there is hazardous substances. Okay, so those are the three that they prioritized. And what they've done then is they've talked about the moral reasons in terms of reducing injury, protecting people, you know, doing our duty of care, the financial impacts, you know, what could happen, what costs could occur if we don't take this action. And also then from a legal point of view, linking in with costs, you know, if the enforcing authority arrived, or if people were injured and they put in a civil claim for compensation, where would that leave us in terms of cost? And also, could we be prosecuted? Could we be fined? Could there potentially be imprisonment, things that could be put in place? Okay, so it's a discussion around there. You can see there's more here from a legal enforcing action that could be served. They could have a prohibition notice which could stop them. The legal requirements which they're breaching. Within the UK, we've got something called the work at height regulations. So they're saying we're breaking those because where people are working close to an excavation, a pit, they could fall into it. Therefore, we need to provide a safer means of work. COSH, control of substance hazard to health, breathing in the dust. That legislation is being broken. So therefore, that's another reason why they should put that extraction system in. And then we've got a case here for civil claims, the civil side of the law. So what you're doing in those paragraphs is you're using, or you're trying to convince the person that's reading it, this is why we need to take these actions, and you're convincing them from a moral, a legal, and a financial point of view. Okay, and also, as you can see, a bit about the damage to reputation of the organization. That's the first bit. The second bit then is to talk about the likelihood and severity of the actions. The likelihood and severity of the existing risks, and then to talk about the impact that the control measures would have on reducing the risk. So as you can see, likelihood and severity. The likelihood of injuries occurring from working in and around the pit is quite high. It's due to its regular use in the area. The severity could be fairly serious. Injuries are likely to range from minor, such as bruising, to possibly fractures, and very serious, such as head injuries if they fell into the pit, obviously. The severity will depend upon at what height the worker falls from. And then we've got 2 and 3 together because they're both about hazardous substances. Okay, it's more likely that the worker will become ill through inhaling a hazardous substance. The likelihood of ill health is quite high for dust inhalation. Most of the workforce and the general public are currently exposed to the dust. They're not carried out in an enclosed area. Inhalation of dust could cause asthma. Breathing in the dust over a long period of time could also cause occupational cancers. So they say there's a high likelihood of them their health being affected, and they've talked about the severity. All right, and then just to finish this bit off, controlling the risk. So they basically said, if we implement the controls, this is the effect it will have, and this is why we've chosen the timescales. So as you can see in the first example, the bridge will remove working practices in the area of the pit. At the moment, workers tend to jump from one side to the other, which is obvious risk. I have given a timescale of 2 months, as this is a specialized piece of equipment that nobody in the business has used before. The business will need to source a supplier and then arrange a delivery date. It is hoped that this project will be completed well within the 2-month timeline. And then they've done a similar thing for the dust enclosure, and also a similar thing for the on-tool extraction system. Okay, so that completes part 3. So they've picked the 3 actions. They've justified them in terms of moral, legal, and financial reasons. They've said what the existing risks are without these controls in place. They've also commented on what effect these controls will have on the risk. And they've also justified why they've chosen the timescales for those actions. Okay, the last bit, or just before we move off, I should say, the marking criteria for part 3, okay, is have they selected 3 actions? That's important. Is there a moral, legal, and financial argument? As I said, if you're in the UK legislation. If you're outside of the UK and international, it could be ILO requirements, recommendations, your local or national legislation and standards you can talk about there as well. Okay, consideration of the likelihood and severity of each action and hazard, and a description of how effective each action is likely to be in controlling the risk. Okay, so that's part 3. Again, I'll come back to any questions in the chat box in a moment, if I may. Part 4, review, communicate, and check. So this is where now we must, first of all, identify and select a realistic review date. In other words, I am going to review the risk assessment on this date, and this is why I've chosen it. So you must say why you've chosen that date. Indicate how the findings of the risk assessment are going to be communicated to others. In other words, safety meetings, toolbox talks, department meetings, whatever it might be, and then indicate how you will follow up to check that the actions have been carried out. In other words, how are we going to check that the actions are being completed? How are we going to monitor that? So, the worked example. This is the last bit, and as you can see, between 10 to 50 words for the first one. Get the review date. So they've said company policy, as an example here, is to review risk assessments at least 12 months. I therefore set the review date for 12 months time, and they've actually said the actual date, 23rd of July, 2020. Okay, obviously this was done last year. So put the date in, don't just say 12 months time, put the actual date in. You might decide that you want to review the risk assessment in a shorter period. It might be a couple of months. That's fine. You could put that in and put the actual date and say why you've chosen to review it in 3 months' time. Indicate how the findings are going to be communicated. So they've said here, I will arrange a meeting with the finance director to go through and agree the actions. I will then provide a summary of the findings and the actions for the workshop and stores manager. These will be emailed initially with follow-up meetings. The findings will be included in the next available toolbox talk, where I will also advise the workers on the actions that are being taken. A summary of the risk assessment and actions to be taken will also be posted on the company intranet that all workers have access to. And then how are they going to check that the actions have been carried out? I will set diary reminders for roughly 10 days before the action is due to be completed. I will speak to the responsible person for each of the actions to find out the progress against each. Should the action not be on target, I will find out the reasons. Is it down to finance or other resources? If any actions look like they are not going to be completed on time, I will speak to the finance director to see if additional resources is made available. Actions that are very overdue, more complex than 6 months late or more than 6 months late, will be referred to the managing director via the finance director. So they basically said how they're going to review it and also what they're going to do if timescales start to slip, if actions are not being completed in a timely way. Okay, so have they done this? Well, there's the 3 criteria. Okay, a realistic review for the risk assessment and say why they've chosen the date. You must indicate how the risk assessment will be communicated and include who needs to know the information. And also you must indicate how you will follow up on the risk assessment to check that the identified actions have been carried out. And we've looked at the worked example to see how that can be done. Okay, remember I said earlier on as well, and you can also download this from your learning materials I showed you in the resources section. There's a useful checklist. Now the checklist looks like this, and this is the actual form which NEBOSH use when they are marking your NG-IG2 risk assessment. What they do is when they mark it, they write in this box, met, not met. And then the second page of it, which we haven't got, they've got, is a feedback sheet. And you will get that sent to you after your assignment has been marked, when you know, hopefully, whether it's a pass. But what you can do with this is you can tick it off, can't you? You could say, okay, have I included the name of the organization? Yes, I have. We can tick it. Have I said where the site is based, the site location? Yes. Is there numbers of workers employed included? Yes, and so on. So you can use this as a check to make sure that you've done everything that you need to do. And as we said earlier on, an example of what you need to do and how you can present that information we saw in the worked example, which I said you can download from your learning materials. Yeah, I can certainly do that. Are you talking about the checklist and the worked example? Okay, if you are, I can show you that briefly because we're coming towards the end of the session now. So let me just find the slide that we were looking at. Okay, if you remember, it was, let me just go back a slide. Okay, so this represents the front page of your learning materials with all the elements listed. Go down to the bottom where it says practical application, find where it says general certificate practical application guidance, click on that. Okay, that will then take you to this page. Click on that, which will take you to the information. Okay, but also if you click on resources or look to the right hand side, which is here, just go into that, you will also see the, as you can see, checklist just by my red dot. I know it's very small. Checklist, example, forms, and also there's blogs, which will give you information. And also similarly, if you click on the resources tab, that then opens this page. And again, you've got the same information listed and you just click on open and you can open it up, you can download it and save it, you can complete it. Okay, so what I recommend that you do before you do anything with the practical is, okay, you select these things. So you go through the practical, all right, you click on the guidance, you watch and you look at everything in this section, all right, and then go to this, go to the resources, download those documents and have a good look through them. Okay, and also read the blog as well that we've got on our website. And that should give you as much information as you need. And then when you then go about completing the risk assessment, keep an eye on the checklist. Have I done this? Have I done that? And also use that example to show you how you should lay out the information and follow that example. But remember, the information you put in there must be your information, your work. Make sure you do not copy the example. It must be your work and your work only. Okay, let me just go to the last little bit then. So we got down to the checklist, didn't we? Okay, so administration then, admin, how does it work? Okay, well, we've already spoken just now, earlier on, that there are submission dates available. They are set in advance. As I said earlier on, follow the links in the course to request the list of dates, and then you can choose the one which you want if you haven't already done so. If you've already done it, then you've already got your submission date. That is the date that you need to submit your practical to us, to the email address. Send it to, as you can see, niboshadmin@astutis.com. That's the email address that you need to send it to. Okay, that should also be in the email that you sent. Yeah, there's the email address. I just mentioned it, niboshadmin@astutis.com. Okay, so make sure you submit it by that date. As I said, if you're going to handwrite the assessment, you then need to scan it in because it needs to be sent to us in electronic format, either in PDF or as a Word document. Obviously, there is an electronic form available for you, which you can just complete and then send it in. But we must receive it by that date that you've chosen. If we receive it later than the date, then unfortunately, we have to instruct NEBOSH that it wasn't received. So please send it to us by that date. Okay, and I would say it needs to be with us by midnight UK time on that day. I would recommend that you send it before that date so you know we've got it. We don't mark it, NEBOSH marks it. So what happens is you send it to us. We've already registered with NEBOSH that you're going to submit it. You send it to us, and then we then send it to NEBOSH. NEBOSH then mark it. We don't mark it. We have no input in the marking whatsoever. Okay. NEBOSH mark it. They will then send you confirmation as to whether it was a pass, hopefully it will be, or a refer. Okay. They will also provide a feedback sheet, which I think what happens with the feedback sheet is the feedback sheet gets sent to us and then we send that on to you. Okay, but the letter that you get confirming whether you've passed or you've been referred comes directly from NEBOSH because they mark it. Refer means, unfortunately, you didn't pass. You didn't meet the criteria. And as I said earlier on, that checklist, if I just go back, that checklist, okay, this is the checklist which NEBOSH use to actually mark your practical. You have to get the word met. In other words, you've met that marking criteria. So they write the word met in this box. And what they're looking for, or what they need to ensure, is that on their marking sheet, every box has the word met in it. If any of those boxes they write not met, then unfortunately you have not passed. So you only need one box to have not met, and the whole thing is referred, it's not passed. But what they will do on the feedback sheet is they will tell you which boxes you have not met, and they'll give you some feedback as to why you haven't met it. So you're able then to look at it and then resubmit it at a later date after you've made those corrections. Okay, so let me just clarify. When NEBOSH mark, okay, let's start from the beginning. You submit your practical when you've completed it, and you send it by email to neboshadmin@astutis.com by the submission date. Okay, we then, as Astutis, we then send that to NEBOSH. When NEBOSH mark it, they will then email you. So the email address that they've got registered for you, they will send you the results of your practical. They don't come from us, they come from NEBOSH. They will send it to you, to your own personal email or the email address that you gave us to register you with NEBOSH when you started the course. Okay? And what will probably happen then is that afterwards, sometime afterwards, you will get the feedback sheet, which is basically that sheet completed by the NEBOSH marker. And I think we send that to you. Okay? But the first thing you'll get will be a letter in an attachment to an email from NEBOSH to your personal email address, and that letter will say whether you've passed or whether you've been referred. Yes, your personal email, the email address that you gave to us when you registered for the course. So whatever email address you give to us, that's the email address that we told NEBOSH you can be contacted on. That's the email address that they will use to send the results. If your email address has changed, then you need to change, you need to notify Learning Advisor at astutis.com. In other words, you need to.
Can I just jump in for 1 second,
yes,
Andrew?
Yes, of course.
Sorry,
you can.
2 days before, like on the 30th of November, 2 days before the NG1 exam on the 2nd of December, I have received from Astutis, from Tom Leah, our director, one email that says you need to change your credentials. That means the password for the examination, paper, which I've done.
Okay.
Is that going to create any complication?
No.
Friction or so?
No. Let me just explain what that was. That was when you, let me explain. When you registered for the OBE exam, the open book exam, okay, in order for you to get access to the NEBOSH system to see the exam, they had to give you a password and a username and a password. Okay. Now that, I don't know what username you were given or what password you were given, but you use that to get into the NEBOSH system to actually access the test. Okay. That's not the email address which they will send your results to.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you.
That's okay.
Yes.
All right. So they will send your results to the email address that you gave when you started the course. This is how you can contact me. All right.
Yeah, because you are actually the provider of the course on behalf of NEBOSH.
Exactly.
Right. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Very
kind of you.
No problem. Okay, so on that note then, does anyone have any other questions?
Andrew, hi.
Yeah, there's a
May I
There's
request you
Yeah.
to go back to the slide where it shows the 10 hazards, please?
Okay. Yeah.
Because I
Just
couldn't see the 10 hazards from the 5 hazard categories.
okay. So what we've got is was it this one?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Now this isn't the full form. Okay. This is from the worked example, but obviously we haven't put all of the worked example on the slides. We just showed you the front page. Okay. If you want to see all of the worked example, then you can get that by going into your learning materials and to download the example that I showed you earlier on. And that will show you all of the form. Okay.
So, to understand correctly, only one hazard is mentioned over here, dust.
Yes. Yeah. Only one on this slide. Okay.
All right.
In the worked example, which you can download from your online learning materials, you can see then all of the hazards. There are actually 10 on there, and it actually covers quite a few pages, part 2. So if you have a look at that, you can see all the different hazards and the hazard categories which they've included as an example.
All right. Clear now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Okay. Does anyone else have any questions? I think there was a question in the... Yeah, go on.
Great. Quick one. I wanted to find out if you get a refer, do you have to pay the exams fees, or you can just go ahead and register and write?
There is a fee to retake the exam. Yes, there is. I don't know what that fee is. I think it's a little less than the original fee to do it the first time. But yes, unfortunately, because of the administration that's required, if you unfortunately get a refer and you then want to redo it, there is then a re-examination fee which you must pay. I don't know what those fees are. You'd have to contact our admin people to get those fees.
That's fine. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Anybody else got any other questions?
No, really useful. All the information that you provided from my part,
Okay.
Andrew, really
Good.
appreciate it.
Okay, that's good. No problem. So just as a reminder then, if you've got any queries about the practical, any questions, remember we cannot pre-mark or pre-read any of your work. But if you've got a specific question such as, as an example, I'm not sure which hazard category this hazard belongs to, we can advise you on that, okay? Or if you said, I'm not quite sure how many hazard categories there are and what categories, what they are, we can advise you on that as well, okay? So if you've got any queries like that, safetyadvisor@astutis.com is the email to send that inquiry to. If there are any inquiries regarding registration dates or any administration questions, then learningadvisor@astutis.com is the email to send that inquiry to. So there is help there, okay? Don't be afraid to send any questions in. If we're not allowed to give you that advice, we will tell you, okay? We'll be straight with you and we'll say, I'm sorry, I can't give you advice, but we might say, you might want to look at this. So we might point you in a certain direction, but you know, I'm sure you won't. It will be just general questions that you might ask. Okay, so
right, so you left the cherry on the top at the last that we can actually apply to your support and help till the paper submission.
Well, what I mean is if you asked a question about have I included the right hazard categories, we couldn't say yes or no, but we could point you towards the guidance to say, have a look at page whatever it is. Yeah,
It's
page 6.
More than nothing.
This is where you will find it. Yeah, that's all we can do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank
all right,
you very much, Andrew.
That's okay. So I'll leave it
Have
there.
a lovely day and a lovely evening.
And you. Thanks, everyone else. Thank you for your input and for your patience and for everything today. And I wish you well. Good luck in everything. If you're celebrating Christmas as well, then have a good Christmas. If not, then have a good holiday if you're on a holiday. If not, then take care of yourself. So thanks, everyone, and I'll sign off now.
Thanks, Andrew. Good
Thank
session.
you
Bye.
very much.